So today I'm going to be showing how to reassemble a 1990 GSX750F engine or Suzuki Katana engine. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to recommend is putting your transmission in the neutral position. And then after that, you're going to want to put in the pins and make sure that they fit on both sides. I had to shave both of them down a while back because they wouldn't fit. Really annoying. These little pieces that go on top of the transmission for both sides as well. These two over here. I like to put grease underneath these two pieces. And before installing this entire section, you want to put oil in the grooves right underneath all of them. It helps to lubricate it. Keep in mind that these two O-rings over here can go on the other side of the crankcase, as well as the one that is on the other side of the crankcase right here. It's really a matter of personal preference at that point. After that, you're going to want to install all of your gasket maker around all the sides. I'm just using some high temperature stuff that I got at Walmart a while back. You're also going to want to note the position of this little pin right over here, as well as the one on this side. You want to make sure when reassembling it, they're in that exact position. The next thing you're going to want to do is put in this large pin and this one over here as well, and the one in this corner over here. It also doesn't really matter which side you put it on, as long as you put them in one of them. Now we put oil in each one of these grooves. I also like to move these two grooves that were over here earlier and put them inside of here in this position. You're also going to want to note the position of this thing right over here, as if you put it in the other direction, you're going to have to take it apart later. You're also going to want to put some grease in there to hold it in nice and tight so it doesn't fall out. I also like to put a small amount of gasket maker on this side before I install it. And also keep in mind that you want to do this relatively quick. You don't want to let your gasket maker dry for too long. Now that I'm confident the whole thing's ready to get put together, I'm going to start reassembling this side on top of that. I also just decided to move these side pieces onto this side of the crankcase as well for both of them, and I have grease holding them in. It also is going to help a lot if you assemble the transmission with the top and lower part of the crankcase alone. That means like without this or anything extra, and just so you can line up this part and this part over here along with these little clips. Once your upper and lower are together, but not all the way, you just want to start tapping on it with a rubber mallet or something. And you're going to pay special attention to the transmission parts. They never like to line up. It's just really annoying. And another thing is this piece right over here. You notice how I held onto it the entire time. That's because the two black pieces that are down in there love falling out. So you want to make sure that you have both the black pieces in the exact position they're supposed to be. Also keep in mind the different pins, the one that's back there, the two up front, and the clips over here. You just want to make sure that everything is in together before you go any further. Now it's time to begin tightening all these bolts over here. These are going to be the main bolts in your crankcase that keep the torque. You're also going to want to keep in mind that when putting them all back together, the general rule of thumb is just to have a decent amount of space between every single one of them. It's just how you know you have the correct bolt in the correct position. After that, there's a washer right over here on this side and another one right over here. You're also going to want to keep in mind that this oil pipe over here has to be installed, as this bolt right here does also keep a lot of pressure. One annoying thing is that this oil pipe right here, once installed, actually protrudes out slightly against this right here. So if you then decide to lay the crankcase down, you'll be putting a lot of pressure on this oil pipe, and you don't really want to do that. If you look at my book over here, it shows you the specific order that you want to tighten all the bolts in, as well as the initial and final tightening for each one of them. Now that we have everything over here torqued down to a good specification, it's time to move on to this over here. What I'm going to do is install all of these in various parts of the crankcase to help hold it together, except this one over here and this one over here don't do that, and you probably don't have this one right here removed. So I just lined up all of the bolts, and if we look up here, I'll show you them. We have two over here and two over here that are the same size. These two over here are separate size but the same, and then we have one in the center. Now we move down here and we add both of these in there and keep flipping the crankcase. Now we get to the other side and we got this one straight up over here And then down here, we have two over here that are the same size, and then a separate longer one over here. Once we've tightened up all the ones underneath and the ones on top and everything, it's time to move on to installing this piece right over here. Then we can install this over here, which you probably didn't remove in the first place. Now we install these two and one right over here. Now we're gonna install these two nuts. One goes right over here and the other one goes right there. For the next step, we're gonna install this bracket right over here, and then we're gonna install this section right over here. It has a spring on both sides as well as a small pin. Now we're gonna install both of these brackets in this exact position. Now we install this gear onto this. There's a washer behind it, as well as on top of it right here, and then it has the circlip. Now we push this assembly through and line it up just like this. Washer, and then this little clip right here. Now we're gonna start installing the pistons right over here. To install the piston, it's helpful to install the middle ones first because you have to access the rings in the center. It's also recommended that you replace the rings whenever you come into the engine, just because if the ring essentially breaks, it's gonna start pushing out the cylinder and it's gonna start scraping the wall, and you just really wanna replace the rings whenever you go into the engine. It's also a good thing if you decide to coat these cylinders in some oil as well. Install it, you're also gonna wanna install the first clip on the side that you can't easily access, and then push the cylinder through and then push on the other clip. Next, you'll want to install this little piece of rubber. Now I'm going to start putting the crankcase on the bike. Both of these nuts are the kind of lock nuts that are recommended you replace them every single time you take them off. That being said, I'm not doing that. I'm just throwing on some red Loctite, and that should be plenty enough. It's also torqued at 55 foot-pounds for each one of them. Now the next step is to install this oil pipe underneath the bike. Once you've managed to install that last oil pipe, it's time to install this piece right over here with the gasket on it. Once you've got that piece on, it's time to move on to this. Make sure it's completely clean before you put it in. Now the next step is to install this piece right over here, and then after that, just throw the oil pan on. To line it up properly, it helps to tighten all the bolts so there's just a small gap around the entire surface, and then tighten it with a new gasket on, tight enough to where it's not gonna create an oil leak. Now it's time to throw this piece right over here, and this piece right over here. Now it's time to start installing the lower frame. First, what you wanna do is line up the bolts in the back for both sides, and then just lightly put in these top bolts. And make sure that you have space to line up these later on. And also pay attention to this one right over here. You're definitely gonna wanna install this before you tighten any other bolts. You wanna pay attention to what's behind this right over here. It's got that very odd shape to it. So when you tighten it, it tightens against the engine. After I've got all the bolts lined up on here, I like to add a small amount of blue thread lock to some of them and tighten them down enough to where any vibration wouldn't shake any of them loose. And you want to also pay attention to these over here. Make sure you line them up early before you start tightening everything else. Now I'm going to start installing all of these other pieces onto the engine itself with this gasket over here. The first thing you're going to want to do is start oiling the sides of all your pistons. You want to put oil on anything that can have friction when it's running. So now I'm installing this gasket right over here with a special kind of sealant on it, this copper spray gasket. It's high temp as well. Strongly recommend you get it because it's just very clean. If you use any kind of other gasket, it can leak when you start to apply pressure with the bolts on top, and you can eventually get some of that gasket maker inside over here or anywhere else, and that can actually cause your oil lines, like right over here, to essentially just get stuck, and you'll ruin the engine very, very quickly if you have any gasket get in there. So just really encourage you to get this right over here, spray it on both sides, and then install this. Don't forget that there is an upside to this gasket. Now I'm installing the cylinders. What I did was I put oil around the pistons and the rings, as well as in the cylinders themselves. And you're gonna wanna make sure the chain isn't like on top of the part of the engine to stop it from going down. But the main thing you're gonna wanna do is first line it up like this. And then right now I'm working on installing this one and this one first. First, you line it up so that it's sitting on the rings, and then you get the first ring on this side, and you want to push it in, like squeeze it, so that it's inside the cylinder. And then you do the first ring on top for this one, and then the second ring for this one, and then the second ring for this one. After that, the bottom piece should essentially just slide in pretty easy for both of them. You might have to squeeze them a bit. And then after that, you rotate it, the engine slightly, so that this and this piston go up instead, so that then you can line these ones up inside the same way you did these ones earlier. If you look at my book over here, you can see this special kind of a tool that they're using to squeeze the piston rings. This is the part number for both of the parts, this part right here and the actual body piece. So if you want to get the exact ones, go for it, but I'm just going to be doing everything by hand. Now that I've got the cylinders lined up on it, I'm going to go to the back over here and install a nut, this one right here, right over here. Now it's time to install the oil pipes. I've already got one of them installed right over here. And you're also going to want to keep in mind that the book recommends to install a specific type of grease right along the O-rings. I'm just going to be using some high temp grease that I've got over here to do it. You're also going to want to replace the O-rings on here. It's a very common spot to have an oil leak, and you don't want to have to take apart the engine just to replace this O-ring. Now that both of the oil pipes are installed, it's time to put these O-rings on top of here. They got some metal in them, so they're not pure O-rings, but I don't really know what to call them other than that. You'll also notice that the nut back there that I tightened up earlier, I decided to loosen it because I noticed when I tightened it, it pulled this back piece down too much, and it was kind of like pushing up the front. And even though the book says to do this, like that part first, I decided I'm not going to do that first. I'm going to tighten the upper part and then tighten that nut, just because I want it to line up really nice. Now I'm going to be going over this gasket right over here, and I'm going to be spraying it with this stuff right over here, just like I did the one that goes right below the cylinders. As you can now tell, the gasket is on, it's coated properly, and it's all ready for the next part. It took me a while, but I was finally able to just put this piece in. What's going to happen is it's going to get caught up on the side of the frame, and it's going to feel like it's impossible and look like it's impossible to actually install it through this direction. However, it is possible. I did also decide to move this pin, the same as the one on the other side, on the bottom when I installed it, so to help it kind of move around when it's up here. And that helped a little bit, but it's just going to take a long time to install this piece because it really likes to get caught up on the frame. Don't forget to line up these oil pipes with the top piece as well while you're dropping it in. The next thing you're going to want to do is look inside of here and place all of the washers on top of their appropriate spots. And keep in mind, the two side ones right over there and the one further over there, those are the ones that aren't made of brass. Next, you'll want to install all of these with these two and these two on the sides, right inside up here on top of those washers from earlier. You'll also want to probably clog up this section in the middle before you even add the washers. I've dropped them in there before, and they're not magnetic, so you can't just fish them out with a magnet, so it's particularly hard to get them out a lot of times. So just clog this up with some paper towels or something so you don't drop anything down it. After you've managed to install all of these bolts, you're then going to want to move on to tightening them. You're going to want to tighten them in this order, and you're also going to want to tighten them to 25.5 to 29 foot-pounds. You're also going to want to keep in mind that you want to tighten them slowly. You don't want to tighten one all the way down and then move on to the next, because you're applying too much torque to an individual bolt at one time. Slowly tighten them all down. Once you've tightened everything down up here, you want to move on to over here and tighten this bolt and this nut. For the next step, I'm going to be installing this ground wire with a 10mm bolt that goes right in between that bolt and another one right over here. For the next step, I'm installing this cover over here, these two, and then these two right over here. All four of them have a lock washer underneath. It's helpful to route both of these wires, one for the neutral position sensor and the other one for the kickstand relay, right behind this piece right over here. Now I'm going to be installing this piece right over here, which is the neutral position sensor. To do this, it has an O-ring right over here, and it's also got this spring and this little sensor piece right here that goes right in this hole over here. You're also going to want to install this chain behind this piece right over here. To do this, you might have to remove the wheel itself. It depends on what kind of chain you have. In my case, I have a chain that doesn't have a clip where I can simply remove one link, so I have to remove the rear wheel just so I can get it over this piece right over here. Now I'm going to be installing this kickstand relay right over here. Now I'm going to throw this sprocket on without the chain attached to anything. Just for now, I'm not going to tighten it just yet. I'm now going to be installing this thrust washer. You can see the slight curve on it, and you want the flat side to be pointing outwards like this. Next, you install this outer gear onto the clutch housing. Now I'm going to pick this piece up, turn it around 180 degrees, and then throw it right on here. Now I'm going to clean up both of these parts and then lubricate them in oil. After that, I can pick it up and then install it right in here. Next, I install this washer right over here. Next, I clean and put this piece right over here. For the next step, I'm going to be cleaning and then installing all of these pieces right around here. You can note the order of them in this view. Now I'm going to install this over here, this on top of it, and then this piece right over here. Now I'm going to be installing this special tool right over here to hold the clutch. To do this, you install these bolts over here that originally went on top of these springs. You want to make sure you do not over tighten them, you just want them on pretty snug. Now I'm going to be working on tightening this. I'm using a 32 millimeter. You also want it to be between 58 and 72.5 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to pick up this rod and just push it straight into here. Next, I'm going to pick up this piece and put it right in here. Now I'm going to put this piece right on top of here. Now it's time to install these springs and the 10 millimeters on top of them. When installing these bolts, you want to keep them between 8 and 9.5 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to be installing this cover and this oil pan. First, I'm going to be removing the old gasket maker that's on the sides, and then I'm going to be putting some new stuff on. And you want to do this because this is where the crankcase meets for both of them, so that means it's not a perfectly flat surface, and the gasket maker helps make up for it. You'll also notice the pin that's over here and the pin that's right over here. This is the longest one, these two are the middle-sized ones, and the others are the same size. Now I've moved to this side cover, and I'm going to be installing this piece over here. The first thing you do is route these wires over here all the way through the inside of there, and they come out looking just like this. The next thing you're going to want to do is install some gasket maker so that this rubber piece right here can fit inside of here really nice and actually hold back any oil. You want to install the gasket maker all around the sides so it squeezes in real tight. Now I'm going to be installing these 3 screws right here, here, and over here. Now I'm going to install this piece over here, right over here, making sure that this pin lines up properly with the back over here. Now I'm tightening the center bolt on, and this is a 19 millimeter. You want it to be between 12.5 and 16.5 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to pull off this little screw and attach this little wire. Now I'm back on the other side of the bike, and I'm going to start installing starter clutch parts. Before installing this gear, I removed all the oil from around this piece right here. Now I'm going to be installing the starter clutch. To push the starter clutch on all the way, it helps to rotate it this direction while holding the gear so that it can line up properly on the inside. Now I'm going to be tightening this bolt right over here to 103.5 to 113.5 foot-pounds. To do this, I'm going to need to use this tool right over here to hold the starter clutch in place, and then I'm going to use this to tighten down the bolt itself. I just installed this piece, and as a side note, a really helpful way to do it is to use something just like this. All it is a hollow metal tube. Originally it came from part of the forks, and I just use it as an extension piece so this whole thing can rest right here. That's incredibly helpful when tightening to this extreme foot-pound rating, so just holding it right there is just perfect. Now I'm going to be installing this gear and pin right over here because this is what hooks up to the starter. Now I'm going to be installing this cover over here, right over here. What I'm going to do is put a little bit of gasket maker right along this side and this side where the crankcase parts meets, and I'm also going to add a little bit down here just because I've seen oil leaks come from here quite a lot. Since my rear wheel is attached and everything's torqued down right, I'm going to start moving on to attaching this nut right over here. Before I install the nut right here, first I put this washer here. When tightening this down, you want to look at this piece right over here. The engine sprocket nut between 72.5 to 94 foot-pounds. And then right after this, we're going to be installing the engine sprocket bolt at 6 to 8.5 foot-pounds. This is also a 32 millimeter, but when you're tightening it, it's going to be quite hard because the rear tire is going to want to spin. The book will recommend that you simply push in the rear brake, and that'll be enough to get it to stop moving. However, for me, this didn't work. So instead, I installed this big bar right over here. Essentially, all I have it doing is stopping right over there on top of the wheel and getting caught up on both sides of the swing arm. This allows it to stop spinning whenever any force is applied to it when tightening it. Now I'm going to install this 10 millimeter bolt with washer and lock washer on it. Now I'm installing that 8 millimeter right there and one right on the other side. Now it's time to install this piece over here. You're going to want to pay attention to the top and make sure both of the nubs are still on there. And you're also going to want to make sure the bottom isn't bent and that it's in this shape. To install this part, you put it right here and make sure those side pieces line up with the grooves. The bottom part of it is also going to have to line up kind of in that direction. There's a small little groove that is at the very bottom, and if you put it this direction, you're going to end up bending the bottom piece, and that's just going to lead to some engine slap noises of the chain. Now I'm going to be installing both of these over here and laying the chain on top of it. They're both also labeled, like IN for intake and EX for exhaust. Now it's time to line up the chain properly. First, you're going to want to make sure that there are 21 pins between the label number 2 and the label number 3. You're also going to want to have this rotor right here in this exact position where it's activating. And you're also going to want to have this gear over here, the number 1 arrow, pointing right along the side of the case. When doing this, it helps to first line up this piece right over here, and then move on to up here and make sure the intake side has that hole on the right side, and the other one has it on the left side. After that, you want to move on to actually aligning the chain. You then find first over here, line up the number 1 arrow so it lines up flat against this. And then you're going to want to find the number 2 arrow and make sure that there are 21 links, including the ones on the arrow that go up to the number 3 on this side. After you do that, you're then going to want to double check, make sure the number 1 arrow is still flat against it. And then after this, we're going to be installing all the pieces that actually hold it down. When installing the parts that go on top of this, you're going to want to make sure that you lubricate the entire section with oil. You can also use moly paste, which is recommended in my book. But I've noticed that if you use the correct amount of moly paste in all the places in the engine, it tends to build up. It's kind of odd. You'll have sections pull up right around in here and then the sides. And then on the bottom where your oil pan is, you're going to have a ton of moly paste just sitting on the bottom. So I like to just use oil just to avoid that. When lining these up, you have to pay attention to the letter and the shape that's around them, this being D square, and you'll be able to line them up properly in this way, with D square being on the bottom right and so on. You'll also want to be able to read the letters from this direction and also have this shape on top of each of the bolts you're using. When tightening these, you're also going to want to tighten them not one at a time, but all slowly. This is because you want to bring the entire section down slowly and at the same kind of pace for all of them. Now I'm installing this piece right over here. Before installing this piece over here, it's helpful to double check that you have exactly 21 links between both of the number 3 and the number 2 position arrows. There's pointing forwards on the bike. Now I'm going to be installing this part of the tensioner with the gasket right over here. I'm also going to try to keep this position of the little piston piece in the same position it was when I originally removed it from the bike. I have all my timing parts installed. Everything's tightened down, it should be in the right position, and I have this section right over here in. Now I'm going to be tightening the tensioner for this chain right along here. And as you can see, I have kind of like a really weird setup going on over here. Essentially, I just have this really long piece over here to apply leverage and push in this just random bolt that I have lying around, which in turn pushes on the piston, and you can actually hear it click. So each time you push it in a certain amount, it clicks and is grabbed by this mechanism, and that essentially helps hold the tension on it. And the main reason that you want to do it in this really weird setup, instead of just plugging in this spring and this right over here, is simply because they don't work. Essentially, that spring is brand new, and even with it all the way in, tight and everything, it doesn't actually apply enough pressure to prevent the timing chain from slapping. So I like to go by hand, do this, and start pushing it. And there's not really a perfect way to do this, in the sense that you might over tighten it, you might under tighten it. You don't really know. That being said, it would be best, if this is your first time doing this, to under tighten it at first. Just do very little, pushing it in. And afterwards, if you hear the chain slapping, just take everything back off, do this again and push it in some more, and do that till you don't have chain slap. At higher RPM, if it's too loose, that is especially prone to happen. But you're just gonna have to be really careful with actually pushing this in. It's also important to note that if you decided to take apart your engine and you made sure that the piston is in the original position, you can just throw it right on in and keep it in that position, and it should be fine. That being said, you're probably gonna have to do this as well. Now I'm going to be installing this section right over here, and just by putting it straight in here and then tightening it down a little bit. When tightening this part down, my book says something like 30 foot-pounds or something ridiculous. I was once doing that on this bike, and before I even reached that torque, I actually snapped this entire section off. And instead, all I like to do is tighten it up with a 19mm and bring it to reasonably tight. Before going any further, you're going to want to line this piece up over here to start checking apart. After you do that, you're going to want to go back over here and look at the arrow that's right along there and make sure that it's pointing exactly along the side of this case right over here. I now recommend that you go over the valves and adjust the valve clearances. This is because whenever you reassemble the engine, you have to reset the valve clearances because now they're not what they used to be. I also just posted a video explaining how to do it, so you can go to my channel and check that out if you're curious how to do it. Now I'm going to be installing this gasket and cover right over here with a little bit of gasket maker right along here and on the other side as well. And I'm going to also put a little bit on top of here. Now I'm going to be installing the starter right over here by putting in some 10mm over there. Now I'm going to start installing the alternator by first installing the cap onto it. After you've managed to get all the 8mm nuts on, it's time to start installing the alternator and then the 12mm bolts that are on it. There's 3 total. Now I'm going to hook up the starter wire. Now I'm going to hook up these 3 wires that come from back over there, and then I'm going to plug them into these 3 over here. Now I'm going to start installing these 18mm spark plugs, and I'm also going to be adding some anti-seize lubricant right around the sides, just so it can actually come out easier the next time I pull it out. I also made a separate video explaining spark plug maintenance and just how to work with them. I recommend that you look at it, despite spark plugs being a fairly simple thing to work with. For the next step, I'm going to be putting in about 50 milliliters of oil in every single pocket up here. Now I'm going to be installing the cylinder head cover. First I'm going to clean it up a little bit, and then I'm going to be adding a little bit of gasket along to each of these 4 corners on the sides and a little bit on top of each of these gaskets. You're also going to want to put gasket maker underneath the main gasket right over here before you install this gasket. Once I've got the cover on, I'm going to begin tightening all 4 of these 10mm, and I'm also going to recommend that you replace the washers that's underneath them. There's a brass one at the bottom, and it's recommended you replace that to avoid any kind of oil leak. After I've tightened those 4 to a reasonable amount, I'm going to move on to installing all of these ones. First, I'm going to clean them up though. You should inspect each of the gaskets before you install them and possibly replace them. After you've tightened them all up a decent amount, you want to move on to the 10mm yet again and tighten them again to prevent an oil leak from happening from right out of the top of them. Now I'm going to be installing all of these plastic pieces right on top of all of these. They particularly help prevent rust from building up inside of there, and that way it doesn't strip the next time you try to remove it if there's a lot of rust. Now I'm going to make sure this piece is completely straight, completely clean, and then install it right over here. Now I put this whole section together, and then I'm going to also route the clutch cable right through the back of this piece, and then I'm going to attach it right here. Now I just attached the clutch cable right along here, and if you're doing this, it helps if you loosen up or completely remove the clutch cable from the clutch part right here. Now I line it up and just throw the whole thing on. The next thing I do is install both of these oil hoses, and you want to make sure that there's a brass O-ring on this side and the other side of this as well. I'm also going to install this new oil filter, and I'm going to lightly put some oil around the rubber gasket around the side. Before I put any oil in, I'm going to install the oil drain plug. Now I'm going to be installing the entire exhaust system. Yours is probably different than mine, so I'm not going to explain how to do it, but don't forget that there's a gasket behind there as well. Now I'm going to be installing the oil cooler, and don't forget to swap out the O-rings that are up here, and the same on the other side. Next, I install these 12 millimeters right on top over there, just to actually attach this thing to the frame. Now I'm going to install the bottom part of this oil line, and you're probably going to want to replace the O-rings that go on top and on the bottom as well. Once installed, it should look just like this, and you're going to also want to keep in mind that you can't really install this section up here until you've actually installed this over here. That's because you can't access these screws on the side unless you have this not installed and easily flexible. I'm going to move on to the side real quick. First, you're going to want to install this line right over here. It's your clutch line. Once installed properly, you'll have about 3 millimeters of play. After that, you're going to want to move on to this piece right over here. This engages the push rod for your clutch. To do this properly, what you want to do is loosen up the 10 millimeter, and then this slotted screw right in the center, you want to turn that until you actually feel some resistance. That's when you're hitting the push pin itself. Once you've hit the push pin, you then want to back it out about 1/8 or 1/4 of a turn, somewhere in between there. You'll also notice that I have all my bolts out. That's because I just had to line something up, and I haven't done any of that just yet. When installing all 4 of these, you can read the number right along here, and you'll also notice that each one of them is different. The far left is number 1, so you can actually see 1, 2, 3, and 4 on them. You'll also notice that they have the word up written on top of them, so you want to keep that in mind. And underneath, there's an O-ring that you might want to replace. I'm going to throw this piece on, and you're going to want to pull this bolt out before you actually install this because it gets in the way. And you're also going to want to use a washer and this locking piece right over here, right on top of this. Next, I install all 4 of these intake boots. It helps if you add a small amount of Loctite, and I also use my impact driver just to give it that final little tighten. Now I'm installing some ignition parts, as you can see. You'll notice that I have L and right written on them. They're actually slightly different, and here's the code for one of them. You'll also notice that this is a 10 millimeter and it's got a spacer right behind it for all of them. The next thing I do is hook up the wires to it. You'll notice I have one of the grounds right here going to the top left and a positive wire going to the bottom. And if you go over here, a positive wire going to the top. And on the bottom, I have the black and yellow ground wire going to the bottom right. You'll also notice that I have this disconnected and the other one hooks up right over here. That's because I have the coil relay mod installed. I have a separate video explaining how to do that. I highly recommend it if you have an old wiring harness and you just want to improve the spark that you're getting to your bike. Since I've just completed everything that I mentioned in my engine disassembly video, I'm now going to stop filming the rest of me putting this bike together. That's because in my other videos, I explain how to do all the rest of that stuff. So if you want, you can check those out. Among the last things I want to leave you guys with is also don't ever handle your exhaust with your bare hands. And if you do, clean them afterwards. That's because if you do this, you'll actually get fingerprints on the exhaust that will rust into them right when you turn on the engine and heat them up. So be very careful with that. A small detail I forgot to mention is contaminants in your engine. Despite how clean you might think you put all your parts together, you might still have really small materials left inside of your engine. For me, the last time I reassembled it, I noticed that I had a lot of kind of like really small thin debris building up along the bottom of the oil pump filter. You have to remove this piece over here, It's the oil pan, and then right underneath it, you can see the filter immediately. And if that filter gets too clogged up, you're restricting oil from going through the oil pump, and you obviously just don't want that. So you might want to remove the oil pan and clean that small little filter. And you'll also probably want to consider replacing your oil filter sooner than normal.